Freedom Walkers, Chapter 7, Walking to Victory. The city commissioners had expected to break the spirit of the boycott, but the mass arrests, far from delivering a crushing blow, inspired the boycotters and strengthened their resolve. Montgomery Advertiser editor Grover Hall called the wholesale indictments and arrests the dumbest act that has ever been done in Montgomery. On the evening after King was booked and released, thousands of people crowded into a mass meeting at Ralph Abernathy's church. All of the men and women who had been arrested so far assembled at the front of the church as the members of the audience rose to their feet, cheering and applauding, bringing their children forward to reach out and touch the boycott heroes. Abernathy called for a day of thanks, a day when everyone would walk. There would be no carpool, no private cars, no taxis. Boycotters would not turn a key in the switch, nor touch a starter, nor take a cab, but would walk everywhere, so that those who walked would know that others walked with them. City officials had revealed that they did not know the Negroes with whom they were dealing, King wrote. They thought they were dealing with a group that could be cajoled or forced to do whatever the white man wanted them to do. They were not aware that they were dealing with Negroes who had been freed from fear. By now, scores of newspapers and television reporters had descended on Montgomery from all over the United States and Europe, from as far away as Japan, India, and Australia. The boycott, the bombings, and the arrests had become a major international news story. The world was waiting to see what would happen. King's trial opened on March 19, 1956. He had been singled out by prosecutors as a test case in their plan to declare the boycott illegal and to punish its leaders. Trials of the other indicted boycotters had been set aside for the time being. The NAACP had sent lawyers to help with King's defense, but the outcome in that Montgomery courtroom was never really in doubt. King was found guilty. He was sentenced to pay a $500 fine or serve a year at hard labor. Judge Eugene Carter said he had imposed a minimum sentence because of what King had done to prevent violence. I came to the end of my trial with a feeling of sympathy for Judge Carter, King recalled. To convict me, he had to face the condemnation of the nation and the world opinion. To acquit me, he had to face the condemnation of the local community and those voters who kept him in office. Throughout the proceedings, he had treated me with great courtesy, and he rendered a verdict which he probably thought was the best way out. Released on bond, King left the courthouse with his wife at his side and a host of friends following. Outside, he was greeted by television cameramen and news photographers, and by hundreds of supporters who shouted, "God bless you," and began to sing, "We ain't gonna ride the buses no more." The NAACP announced that its lawyers would represent King in his appeal, as well as any other boycott leaders brought to trial. NAACP attorneys were also backing Fred Gray in his federal suit challenging bus segregation. A number of influential rights tried to persuade Gray to drop the case. Some suggested that I dismiss the case outright because it would only create problems in the community and give me the reputation of an agitator, Gray wrote later. Some officials suggested that if I would get my clients to agree to either dismiss the case or have it passed over, I would not have to worry, and they would assure me that from that point forward, I would have all the legal cases I could handle. Of course, I never would have agreed to such an inducement. Early that summer, the boycotters won their first legal victory. On June 4th, a special 3-judge federal court ruled in favor of the boycott leaders. By a 2-to-1 vote, the white Southern judges declared that Alabama's state and local laws requiring segregation on buses violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees equal protection under the law. Segregation on city buses was declared unconstitutional. Attorneys for Montgomery and for the state of Alabama immediately appealed the ruling to the U.S. Supreme Court. For the time being, the segregation laws remained in force. Several months would pass before the Supreme Court could hand down its decision. The battle was not yet won, King wrote. We would have to walk and sacrifice for several more months while the city appealed the case. The bus protest continued. Montgomery's Black citizens had been walking and carpooling for 6 months now. There had been some 50 mass meetings to keep up morale, a dozen bombings, and hundreds of arrests. Boycotters had been threatened, harassed, and fired from their jobs. But the June court ruling was greeted with rejoicing and with a renewed sense of optimism. At long last, a court had upheld the protesters' cause. The first 6 months had been the hardest, everyone agreed. They would keep on walking for another 6 months if they had to. We were not even tired, Fred Gray recalled. 7-year-old Bernice Robinson and her sisters Rosetta, 9, and Naomi, 10, clearly weren't tired. Since the first week of the boycott, they had walked more than 8 miles a day, twice a week, just to take piano lessons. We walked because it was right and because it was wrong to get on the bus, Bernice remembered. And it wasn't easy either, because sometimes white folks would go by and blow the horn or yell things at us because they knew we were a part of what we were doing. In August, there was another bombing. This time, the target was the home of Robert Grates, the white minister who had openly supported the bus boycott. 3 sticks of dynamite exploded in Grates' front yard, with enough force to shatter windows in nearby homes. Again, no one was hurt. Mayor Gale charged that Grates might have bombed his own house in order to encourage out-of-state contributions to the MIA. Perhaps this is just a publicity stunt to build up interest of the Negroes in their campaign, the mayor told reporters. That autumn, the White Citizens Council tried to cripple the boycotters' carpool by preventing the MIA's fleet of station wagons, the rolling churches, from getting insurance coverage. Insurance agents throughout the South were pressured to cancel the fleet's liability insurance. Without such insurance, carpool vehicles could not operate legally. King finally arranged for new insurance through a Black agent in Atlanta who was able to buy a policy from Lloyd's of London, a British firm. The carpool continued to roll. Blacks had stayed off the buses all summer and into the fall. The segregationists did not give up. City officials asked a state court for an injunction banning the carpool as an unlicensed municipal transportation system. If the court agreed, then anyone who continued to operate the carpool could be jailed for contempt. A hearing on the injunction was set for November 13th. The night before the hearing, King went before a mass meeting to warn that the carpool would probably be outlawed. After nearly 12 months, the boycotters would lose their only means of transportation other than walking. Could they persist with the carpool destroyed? Could their leaders ask everyone to walk back and forth every day to their jobs, no matter how far? For the first time, King felt the cold wind of pessimism passing through the audience. And as the meeting broke up, people walked home silently under a cloud of uncertainty. On Tuesday, November 13th, King and his fellow boycott leaders sat glumly in a Montgomery courtroom as lawyers for the city argued that the carpool should be banned and the MIA fined heavily for operating an unlicensed transportation service. During a brief recess, King noticed an unusual commotion. Mayor Gale and Police Commissioner Sellers were called into a back room, followed by 2 city attorneys. Several reporters moved excitedly in and out of that room. Then one of the reporters came over to King and handed him a news bulletin that had just come in over the Associated Press wire. "Here's the decision you've been waiting for," the reporter said. The U.S. Supreme Court had affirmed the lower court ruling, declaring that Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. "My heart began to throb with inexpressible joy," King wrote later. He rushed to the back of the courtroom to tell his wife, Ralph Abernathy, and E.D. Nixon. As word of the decision spread through the courtroom, one man rose and shouted, "God Almighty has spoken from Washington, D.C." Judge Eugene Carter had to bang his gavel several times to restore order. Then, in an almost comic contradiction of the Supreme Court decision, Judge Carter granted a temporary injunction to ban the carpool. The carpool would have to stop operating, but that was beside the point now. Nearly a year after the boycott had begun, the Black citizens of Montgomery had won a dramatic landmark victory. Segregated seating on the buses was about to end. There would be no more rules about who could sit where. It would be so simple. Anyone would be able to sit in any vacant seat. The Supreme Court decision should not be seen as a victory of blacks over whites, King proclaimed, but as a victory for justice and democracy. The following night, the boycotters celebrated at two enormous mass meetings, held at churches on each side of town to accommodate as many people as possible. At one meeting, the Reverend Robert Grates was called to the pulpit for a reading of scripture. The skinny young white preacher, who had risked his family's safety by supporting the Black cause, opened his Bible and turned to these famous words from 1 Corinthians. "When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things." Before he could even finish the sentence, every single person in the church had risen to cheer the passage, a biblical affirmation of the Black community's powerful new sense of pride and self-respect. They were shouting and cheering and waving their handkerchiefs. King remembered, as if to say they knew they had come of age. They had won a new dignity. When Grates concluded, "And now abideth faith, hope, love, but the greatest of these is love," there was another spontaneous outburst. "I knew then that nonviolence, for all its difficulties, had won its way into our hearts," King wrote. There was one more hurdle. The Supreme Court decision would not take effect until the official court papers were issued and served on city officials. Meanwhile, bus segregation was still the law, and Judge Carter's last-minute injunction banning the carpool had already taken effect. "For these 3 or 4 days," King announced optimistically, "we will continue to walk and share rides with friends." As it turned out, 5 weeks were to pass before the official legal paperwork reached Montgomery. This created a problem since the carpool was still banned by court order. To get through the delay, a cooperative share-a-ride plan was worked out for each neighborhood and each street. Coordinated by the Reverend SSC, the plan worked. Car owners shared rides with friends and neighbors, while thousands of other boycotters kept on walking. The buses remained empty. Meanwhile, boycott leaders worked to prepare people for integrated buses. During the twice-weekly mass meetings, speaker after speaker stressed the theme of nonviolence. At several meetings, training sessions were held to teach nonviolent techniques. Chairs were lined up in front of the church altar to resemble a bus, with the driver's seat in the front. Then people from the audience were picked as actors to play the roles of a driver and a black and white passengers, some courteous, others hostile. As the audience watched, the actors played out scenes of confrontations, episodes of insult and violence that might occur when the buses were in fact integrated. If cursed, do not curse back, Black riders were advised. If pushed, do not push back. If struck, do not strike back. Exhibit love and goodwill at all times. After each scene, the actors returned to the audience and another group took their place. Each training session was followed by a general discussion. Boycott leaders visited Black schools and urged students to board the integrated buses as good citizens, calmly and with dignity, committed to absolute nonviolence. And they distributed throughout the city a mimeographed list of suggestions for integrating buses. Passengers were reminded to observe the ordinary rules of courtesy, to say "may I" or "pardon me" as they took a vacant seat beside another rider, white or black. If there is to be violence, in word or deed, the list of suggestions advised, it must not be our people who commit it. On December 20th, the Supreme Court's bus integration order was finally delivered to Montgomery city officials. "I guess we'll have to abide by it," Mayor Gale said, "because it's the law." That evening, thousands of people gathered at the Holt Street Baptist Church, where King had electrified the crowd more than a year earlier with the speech that launched the boycott. The church was packed, and people spilled out into the street for blocks in each direction. Loudspeakers outside carried the voices of speakers and the sounds of freedom songs and spirituals through the crisp winter night air. We sang Sweet Low, Sweet Chariot, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and This Little Light of Mine, I'm Gonna Let It Shine, and a whole lot of others, Georgia Gilmore remembered. Weary feet and weary souls were lightened. It was such a night. We didn't have to walk no more. Even before Martin Luther King got up there and told us it was over, we knew it was over, and we knew we had won. We must not take this as a victory, King told the crowd, but merely with dignity. When we go back to the buses, go back with a quiet pride. Don't push your way. Just sit where there's a vacant seat. If someone pushes you, don't push back. We have the courage to refuse to hit. We must continue to resist segregation nonviolently. On December 21st, 1956, 381 days after the boycott began, Montgomery desegregated its public buses. At 5:55 that morning, an empty bus pulled to the bus stop at the corner near the King home. Wearing his best suit and dress hat, Martin Luther King Jr. walked toward the bus, accompanied by Ralph Abernathy, E.D. Nixon, and Glenn Smiley, a Southern-born white minister and civil rights activist who was visiting Montgomery. Television cameras, photographers, and reporters hovered around the men, shouting questions. The bus door swung open. King stepped aboard. The white bus driver greeted him with a smile and said, "I believe you are Reverend King, aren't you?" "Yes, I am," King replied. "We are glad to have you this morning," the driver said. King thanked him and took a seat in the front of the bus.